Greetings all, and welcome to Daily Pali Reading. Today we are going to cover one of my all-time favorite passages, not only from the Dhammapada, but really my favorite of all the teachings from the Buddhist canon. Also, this episode is going to be included in multiple playlists because this summarizes so many of the teachings we've already come across here. First, we'll knock out the Pali, the grammar, and the meaning. Then we'll talk about how this is a very beautiful, poetic version of the Buddha's teaching on aniccaṃ, impermanence, anattā, not the self, and on overcoming dukkha and of overcoming the possibility of rebirth, of exiting samsara, so to speak. Yathā pubbuḻakaṃ passe, Yathā passe marīcikaṃ, Evaṃ lokaṃ avekkhantaṃ, maccurājā na passati. One should see it like a bubble. One should see it as if it were a mirage. The king of death does not see the person who views the world like this. So let's notice here in the first line that actually two of these words, yathā and passe, are repeated. And that just leaves us with pubbuḻakaṃ and marīcikaṃ to deal with. Let's take passe first. This is the short form of the optative. Being the short form, it actually could be the first, second, or third person singular. And this is the short optative form of the verb passati, to see. I'm going to read this as third person singular, but it will work as first or second. So one should see. That is what the optative is expressing here. It's not a fact. It's not that someone does see. The optative is one should see. And then we have the adverb yathā, meaning just as or like. So one should see, passe, yathā, one should see, we're going to insert the word in English, it. One should see it as or like pubbuḻakaṃ, a bubble. Now the thing about pubbuḻakaṃ, the only thing that I would say about this word is I'm actually reading this as if it were pubbuḻakaṃ. If you look at various English translations, Thai, Chinese, and we'll mention those later on, they all understand this word as bubble. And in the Pali English dictionary, we have to look this up under pubbuḻakaṃ. So one should see it as a bubble. And notice this is the accusative case. It's the object of passe. And then in our second clause here, changes just a bit, but the meaning and the grammatical structure is the same. One should see it as, we still have passe and yathā, marīcikaṃ. Marīcikaṃ is a ray of light or a mirage. Now this is actually a word that if you look up marīcikaṃ, I think you're redirected to marīci. This is a situation, and we came across it in the Metta Sutta, where the ka ending actually isn't changing the meaning of the word at all. This ka ending can change something into an adjective, but here the meaning is just the same. Though it looks like, if you look it up in Sanskrit, marīci is a ray of light and marīcikaṃ is a mirage. Now, when we go to the second line here, we can look through and notice that maccurājā is probably our subject. May not be familiar with the word maccu, but rājā comes up quite a bit. That is our masculine nominative singular for the word king, and that has come up in the Milinda Paño before. The word maccu has come up in Dhammapada verse 21, and we've traced that back to the root mer, which gives rise to like the Latin mortis, and the English words mortuary and mortal. That is, this root has to do with death. This here is a compound, a tapurisa compound. If they were split apart, it would be maccuno, which is the genitive, rājā, the king of death. Then we have na passati. Na is our negating particle. Passati is third person singular present active indicative. Putting this part all together, the king of death does not see. And then here things kind of get interesting grammatically. the actual object of passati is this word avekkhantaṃ, which is a participle. It's a masculine accusative singular participle, present participle, from the verb avekkhantaṃ, to look at, consider, or see. So the king of death does not see. Maccurājā na passati avekkhantaṃ. When we get a present participle like this, we can understand it as one who, that is the verbal part of the participle. Here, one who sees, one who views, one who is seeing, one who is viewing. But we could probably take out that progressive aspect and simply say one who views. And so just to be clear up to this point, this participle is functioning as the object of passati, but it also, since it has a verbal nature, it is going to take an object, which is lokaṃ, world. This word is masculine singular accusative. This is the object of avekkhantaṃ, the world, and actually meaning the universe, and we'll come back to lokaṃ in just a minute. And then we have our last word here, Evaṃ. This is another adverb like this. And that Evaṃ is referring to the entire first line. Now there's a huge amount to talk about here. And since we just wrapped up on this word lokaṃ, I want to point something out that, at least for me, I overlooked for a long time. And dear listener, it may be very apparent to you. But when we are talking about seeing the world, let us not forget we are a part of the world. So when we're talking about seeing the world as if it's a bubble or a mirage, we have to apply this to our mind-body complex, to the 5 khandhas that we regularly identify as ourselves. That's extremely important. If we're simply looking at the external world, so to speak, and looking at it as if it's a bubble and a mirage, that's one thing, but that's only part of the teaching. So let's return to the first line and talk about Yathā for a minute. Because at least in English, and I don't know if the Pali carries this nuance or not, but in English, when we start to understand Yathā as if or like, we might be thinking that this is some sort of metaphor and that we're thinking of the world this way as if it were a bubble or as if it were a mirage, when in fact it really isn't, but that this analogy or this metaphor is helping us understand it to a certain extent. What I would say here is we want to see the world like it's a bubble because it is a bubble. It's exactly the same as a bubble, and it is exactly the same as a mirage. And I think I just realized that that is the it that we were supplying when we said passe. One should see it, meaning the world. We know that once we get to the second line, but that's what's under discussion here. One should see the world as if it's a bubble. One should see the world as if it's a mirage. Now, we should all bask in the beauty of this poetry. I don't want to destroy it by dissecting it too much, but I do want to point out that these are not really haphazardly chosen images. If we think about a bubble, one of its striking characteristics is that it is not long-lasting. It really exhibits aniccaṃ. It really exhibits impermanence. And we know that when we see water bubbles or if we blow soap bubbles, some of them might go pretty far, some of them might last kind of long, but we know at some point they're going to burst. And that is why these we hear about housing market bubbles and stock market bubbles, etc. We know that they're going to burst at some point. That is why that image is chosen. And then the image of a mirage is chosen because it has no substance. It might be a little ray of light gleaming off of some water. It might be some optical illusion that our brain has made. If we try to grasp it, it's not going to happen. You can actually touch a bubble, and in which case it might simply burst, but mirages aren't of that nature. The more you look after them, they're going to remain elusive. So this is an image that is helping us understand anatta. In other words, this image helps us to understand that when we go looking for a self, all we're going to find is emptiness. We're not ever going to come up with an actual self the way we normally think of. And another way to think about this is that just as our mind creates the mirage, it creates an optical illusion, our mind is creating this concept of a self. It's creating concepts of objects, of this and that. And adhering to such notions keeps us in dukkha, keeps us from liberation. Now, the second line tells us that the king of death does not see the person who sees the world like this. What does it mean for the king of death not to see someone? Sometimes we'll come across a very similar notion with exactly the same meaning, which is something along the lines of the Tathagata goes beyond the sight of gods and men. This is another way of talking about entering nirvana, nibbana. The king of death cannot see the person who passes out of samsara. As a matter of fact, if you look at a Chinese translation of this, that's actually what they say, is the person who sees the world like this does not fall into samsara. And when we understand this, and or if we put this with some other of the Buddha's teachings, we might come to a conclusion that's somewhat surprising, that the Buddha is telling us that we should see the world, that it's impermanent, it's like a bubble. Everything in the world, everything that you love is a bubble and a mirage. And the striking or shocking thing is that this insight does not produce nihilism or depression, but it is actually the thing that releases us into pure, unexcelled joy, the unexcelled joy of nirvana, nibbana. Now, the last thing I would mention here is that this verse may make things seem easier than they are. It might be the case that seeing the world this way and actually processing it and understanding that there's no aspect of ourselves that is non-bubble and non-mirage-like, that can take a lot more work maybe than just seeing a bubble pop and saying to ourselves, oh, the world is like that. For some people, it might immediately cause some sort of deep enlightenment and liberation. It might be the fruition of many seeds that they've planted in the past. For others of us, it may take some time to keep working that out. And I think it's very similar to Bodhidharma's see your nature become a Buddha. Again, some people might immediately be able to see their nature. And I believe that our nature is this bubble and the mirage. I think that's a very related teaching to this, or you can certainly find a correspondence here. So we don't necessarily want to give up on the more, quote, prosaic philosophical teachings, if I may put it that way, of the Buddha. But I think that this poetry is extremely powerful, and these images can really aid us in our journey to liberation. Peace, everyone.